Well, good evening to everyone. Hope everyone is doing well and has had a good week. Well, when I originally was planning these lessons, I had planned on 2 nights for historians. And true to form, we're going into a 3rd night. So, Brother Dutch, I'll certainly need another Wednesday or 3, maybe. We'll see. I'll try to compact things. I always do try. So we're continuing on with historians. And so here is the rota of that group of people that I intended to cover. We've already covered Suetonius, Tacitus, and Josephus. And Pliny the Younger is the one who is next up. And then very, very briefly, they're just snippets that relate to Mara ben Serapion and Lucian of Samosata. And then I'm hoping if I can get to that tonight, that we'll be able to deal with an historian who also is considered to be among the early church father group, Eusebius, sometimes called the father of really church history. And so that's the plan. Here are the images that I've been using to represent these historians. I emphasize represent because if you've been with us before, then I've made it clear that nobody really knows for sure what these people look like. But personally, as a student and as a teacher, when I deal with great artists or historians or great thinkers of the ancient past, I like a face. I like to look at a face and think, I can understand that because that person's got a nose and a mouth and 2 eyes just like me. And therefore, they struggled and they had their good times and their bad times just like I do. So for want of anything better, these are my methods, and these are the images that I've used for Suetonius and Tacitus, 2 of the leading ancient Roman historians. And by the way, you should already know as we're going through this material that I'm just gleaning. One of the reasons that I went into the little bit of depth that I did as regards the Caesars when I was sharing with you about Suetonius and Tacitus was not only to provide something of a political context in which Christ and the apostles were living, which I think is always helpful. At least it is for me, in understanding the challenges of living in the time that was dominated by Rome and Roman power. But many, many other things that really impact us in our understanding of the New Testament period in terms of culture broadly. And for those 2, I specifically focused in on a few references, just a couple really in both of these historians' writings that specifically mention Christ and Christians. And I'm going to continue doing that. This is a very subjective thing that I'm doing because for everything I share with you, there are myriad others that we could look at that could be really argued to be worthwhile as regards our understanding of early Christianity and the culture, the times in which it was formed and developed. So do be aware of that. So Josephus was the individual that we dealt with last time, and he is, I think, the most important of the non-Christian authors whose writings have come down to us, who really give us insights not only in terms of Jewish culture. Josephus, as I've shared with you, was a man who was very proud of his heritage, and yet for reasons that are really unfathomable, in the very height of crisis during the Jewish war with the Romans, he abandoned the Jewish people, went over to the other side, and basically was more or less adopted by Vespasian, the first of the Flavian rulers. And yet, proud of his culture, proud of his heritage, he wrote prolifically about the Jewish people and the antiquities of the Jews, as well as other writings. And I'm going to pick up with, I think, one of the most interesting statements that he makes in the Antiquities of the Jews, the one that we concluded with last time, just by way of recap if you weren't with us. And then we're going to switch back to another Roman, and this individual is actually Gaius Plinius, let me get it right, Caecilius Secundus, who history knows as Pliny the Younger. And again, there's another image that is deemed to be appropriate to Pliny the Younger. And then, as I've said, if time allows, we will briefly look at even more little snippets. These shouldn't take much time, but I do think they're interesting. I had frankly never heard myself before of Mara bin Serapion before I started working on this material, and was interested to find out what he had to say. And then Lucian of Samosata. And then finally, we'll conclude with the great church historian at the very dawning of church history. Again, he's sometimes called the father of church history, Eusebius of Caesarea, who certainly was a Christian, a very powerful and influential man of his time. Some consider him to be one of the leading intellects of his day, but also a good friend with Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor. And he has some really interesting things to share with us as well. So last time I was sharing with you a little bit about Josephus, gave you a broad overview of his very checkered history and the challenging decisions that he had to make when Rome and Judea came into conflict and then war. And the quote that I wanted to conclude with, not conclude with, but to recap from last Wednesday is this one that I've already shared with you, sometimes called the Jesus quote, which, if it's all his, is really an interesting thing. And once more, those of you who were here with us last time, you've already heard this, but I always like a little recap. So in his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus, when he's gotten to the point of basically a little before his own time, he says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles." And then there's that loaded statement, he was Christ. And we know that this is not a name, it's a title. He was Messiah. He was the Messiah. And as I told you last time, some maintain that this bold statement affirming that he was the Messiah, some historians look at this and think, I doubt Josephus ever wrote those words. Maybe this was some pious copyist who was moved when they got to this point in making a copy of Josephus's Antiquities, and they just scribble that in under the guise of his having said it. It astonishes me the lies that sometimes are put out there in the belief that you're going to do good with them. And maybe I shouldn't say that in this context, because who knows? Maybe he did write this. Maybe this is no lie. But I know enough about history and biblical history to know that a lot of people thought they were doing good by telling lies and by making up things that were not something that they knew of, were not divinely inspired, because they thought somehow that would help God. What arrogance humanity can have. And we all should know enough about God and God's nature to know that no good ever comes of lying. Let's hope this was Josephus speaking. But if it was, one wonders why he did not openly convert to the faith. That's, I think, a real interesting question. So continuing on, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day. Is that an interpolation too? As the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. So again, this is a very controversial quote from the Antiquities of the Jews, but even if only a part of it is Josephus's writings, then he confirms that Jesus lived. We don't need that. Faith is enough, I think, for us, but it's still nice to get this from other sources. He confirms that Pilate was the Roman official in charge at the time. And as I've told you, some have questioned, debated, even challenged that. Confirms that he was condemned and he was crucified. So those things alone are, I think, worth a few moments of our time, even in recap. Okay, so I'm going to go off just a little bit on a tangent. It's really not a tangent because I think it's important, or I wouldn't bother. If you were in this class last spring, some of you were, then I taught a series of lessons on Romans, the Epistle of Romans. And I have, frankly, cannibalized some of that because I thought it was helpful. And so here is one of those things that I took from that. This is a book I would recommend. It's in my library. The Christians as the Romans Saw Them. We are, I think rightly so, interested in the ancient culture and time in which Christ lived. But how did the pagan Romans, perceive Christians? How did they look at us? I think that's an important question to ask as well. And so I don't even remember when I got this. Many, many years ago, I bought this book and I read a good bit of it. It provides a lot of really fascinating insights as regards some of the negativity that Romans had toward people of our faith at the very beginning of the faith, the very birth of Christianity. And so I also use this one. This is it is a great work of art, but I just use this as a stark reminder, not of an artist or of a painter or of a painting, but of the event. Christ is crucified on a Roman cross in Jerusalem of Judea sometime between AD 29 to 33. We don't know exactly when. And from that point on, with the very birth of the church, the resurrection, and the birth of the church on the day of Pentecost that follows, Christians are susceptible to really social and political pressures and persecution. And in sharing with you about the Roman Caesars with Suetonius and Tacitus, and I'll touch some more on this when we're talking about the martyrs of the faith, then I've already shared with you that Nero in the Julio-Claudian family was the first to initiate an empire-wide persecution. And so there's another one of the veristic busts of that individual. And then we have the third and the last of the Flavians, Domitian. He also actively pursued, sought out, and persecuted Christians. And then the third and final one of these three was Diocletian, who ruled from AD 303 to 313, late imperial period. As late as that, the 4th century, Christians are being actively persecuted for their faith. And these are just the three notorious ones, because even aside from these three, if a Christian came to the attention of Roman authorities, even during the reign of the so-called 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, even under their rule, you could be thrown into prison, you could be threatened, you could be tortured, you could be executed for your faith. And those are the good guys. They're the ones that universally are looked up to as the greatest emperors that Rome had. Fair, dispassionate, hardworking, good administrators, very careful in their work, not crazy, despotic rulers like Caligula, Nero, and Domitian. So I think this kind of thing begs the question, why? Because the Romans were very accepting, very tolerant. they weren't interested really in making enemies. Once they had conquered a country and added it to their empire, they wanted all of the goodwill that they could get because they wanted to milk these people. It's been said that the Romans are really a parasitical and predatory society, and they were. They weren't interested really in the good wealth, or the good health, I should say, the hygiene, the well-being of their subject peoples. They were interested in profit, period. And they were very practical. That's why a judge could condemn a man he knew to be innocent to death, a terrible death, because it would mean that the province would be quietened. And hopefully the disturbance that this man was causing would come to an end. And we'll see that in some of the writings that I'm sharing with you tonight. So they were all about appeasement and keeping the peace. And yes, they were guilty of corruption. They were guilty of terrible things in exploiting the peoples over whom they ruled. But they wanted peace. And so they were very tolerant of other faiths. But not this one. And so why? Why not this one? Well, I've got a couple or three ideas, and I shared this last spring with the Romans class, but I think they're worth repeating because Pliny is a Roman talking about Christians and writing to the emperor in his time, Trajan, one of the so-called 5 good emperors, and he's basically saying, what do I do with these people? And he's looking for the emperor's advice. So we have to, as best as we can, we have to put ourselves in the mindset of the Romans in order to understand really why there's such a bias against Christians. And the first thing here is that initially the Romans just looked at the Christians as a cult, or if you prefer, a subset of Judaism. And they thought that the Jews were overly picky and particular about all kinds of things, the Mosaical laws in the eyes of the Romans, and they didn't know these laws, but they saw them work out in Jewish life, and they saw that the Jews kept themselves aloof, and they would not mingle with the Gentiles, and they would not eat some things, and they just thought this a bunch of nonsense, frankly. And so the Christians were really grouped in with that, just some of the strange things that Middle Eastern people do. And let's just get on with business and bring the prophets in. But the problem is, as we know from the writings and the travels of Paul, is that wherever Paul went, and I'm not trying to blame Paul, but this was no doubt not only true of Paul, but many another evangelist, wherever the gospel went, it would go first to the Jewish community. And as we know from Paul's writings, some would accept it and some would reject it. And those who rejected it did not do so quietly. They did it with vehemence. They were loud and outspoken, and quite often mobs resulted and violence followed. And this is why Claudius, during his rule, AD 41 to 54, basically threw the Jews out because these things were now happening at the capital. And Claudius just didn't want to deal with it, so expel them all, Christians and Jews alike. Well, atheism. Everybody can read that, right? Yeah, I figured out in this space the first time I taught that my little itty-bitty, teensy-weensy print was not readable. So I figured it's got to be 24-point or larger. So atheism, you may be thinking, Christians, atheists? Yes. From the pagan Roman point of view, certainly, because they refuse to acknowledge the gods. And they would have nothing to do with the idols that were the focus of worship. And from a pagan's point of view, that's atheism. And this was the dominant culture at the time. It's not like it is for us today. For us today, we call ourselves a Christian nation. We have on our money in God we trust. Well, I'm not going to get into that. But if you've got somebody down the street from you who's into neo-paganism or who is I don't know what to say, a witch. There are people who actually believe these things and are doing these things now. Somebody who prays to Thor. You ever watch Forged in Fire? Oh, one or two of you. That's a great show. I love that show. Some of the people on that, they have little hammers, and that's a symbol of the pagan Norse god Thor. And every now and then they'll show a scene where they're in their home studio and they've got a little shrine set up, and I'm thinking, really? You really think that's going to do you any good? Well, anyway, if you knew somebody like that, then you'd be looking at them just like in this time, the Romans are looking at Christians and they're thinking, what's going on with that? They're not part of us. They're not part of the majority. And so we weren't. Non-patriotic. The Roman religion was more than just worshiping the gods, Jupiter and Hera or Juno and so forth. There were also the popular past emperors who were grandfathered into the pantheon of Rome. And you were expected to offer incense to the shades, the spirits of these great emperors, these great rulers of the past. And that's a part of the problem as well, because if you're not acknowledging the authority of the state, and you're not doing that by offering incense to the cult idols, not only Jupiter and so forth, but the deified Augustus, the deified Claudius, the deified you name it, then something's wrong with you. You may be subversive. You may be trying to topple the government. Antisocial. That's another one that was leveled against Christians. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense too, because if you are a Christian and you're living in a culture that is predominantly idolatrous, and they have feasts celebrating this or that god, and they eat meat sacrificed to idols, and it hurts your conscience to do that, you're not going to be part of those activities. You're going to hold yourself aloof. And so that too was one of the common things that was leveled against Christians, that they were antisocial. They held themselves apart like the Jews did, but even worse than the Jews. And now we're getting into some of the really weird ones. Maybe, again, if you were here last spring, you might remember this. There were terrible things being said about Christians during this time, including sexual orgies. And so in the Wilkner book that I recommended, you'll find some of these things that are described as regards there was a belief that Christians got together and they had a good meal together, and they were all in a room together, men and women, and there was a candle in there and somebody knocked it over, and who knows what happened in the dark. That's the way people think. The mindset goes down to the lowest common denominator, right down into the gutter. I don't think it's any secret that Rome was notorious for its orgies. I'm not going to talk about that in here. This is one of those things that Paul says it's shameful even to speak about them. But they got this misconception because they heard of the agape feasts, love feasts. And if you're a Roman and if you recognize really no morality, really the Greco-Roman religion was an amoral one. It really wasn't about right and wrong. It was just about setting the parameters for good behavior. And they were very loose. Because if the king of the gods, Jupiter or Zeus, he's known for his constant philandering, he's always running off with some goddess or some mortal woman who catches his eye, then what's the big deal? Surely I, a human being, can do that. Zeus does it, after all. So if you come from that kind of a society and you hear about love feasts and these secret rites, then you're going to naturally think the worst. And they did. Cannibalism? Yeah. The ancient Romans thought that Christians were cannibals because they heard about them eating the flesh and drinking the blood. And terrible stories were told about this too. and believed. So as horrible as the persecutions were, and when we deal with the martyrs, I'm going to go into some of these horrible things that Christians endured. I don't mean to soften it because they were horrible. There's no excuse for it. But these kinds of things help us, I think, better to see why there was such a bias, because it was born out of ignorance and immorality. And the more people understand, the more accepting and tolerant, and then the more open they are, and then some of them are converted. And that took a lot of time. Well, I've shared this before too, but I think this is a very powerful visual as regards what I've been talking about. This is a graffito, literally scratching on the wall. The Romans loved to do this kind of thing. When I was a kid, I grew up hearing that rhyme, "Fools' names and fools' faces are often found in public places." I'm sure some of you have heard that. And boy, that is so true. Everywhere you go in the world, you'll see somebody's written their name on something. Well, Alexamenos was a Christian. And this was actually found, this graffito was found in the ruins of the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. And I know it's hard to make out, so here's a transcription of it. And it's the kind of sophisticated artwork you would expect of somebody who writes on bathroom walls and scratches in public places. And so it says basically, Alexamenos worships his God. And it has a man, probably a Greek, Alexamenos is a Greek name, who is bowing down before a crucified man with a donkey's head. So this is cruel and crude humor. Probably one slave making fun of another one. And I always like to pair that with this work by Stephen Yurtson, "Behold the Lamb of God," which is an effort to more accurately depict the crucified Christ than the typical image that we see. And I find that image personally to be very powerful, very powerful. We typically see him lifted up, and indeed, we're told, and the prophets attest to the fact that he will be lifted up. But the likelihood is that he was not 20 feet up in the air, but rather the hecklers and those who were ridiculing him could crowd around him and more or less look at him in the eye. And that, I think, adds a poignancy to it that is both bitter and powerful. And it also helps us to understand why his last words were heard and so carefully recorded. They may have been just a few feet away from John and other people who made note of what he said. Well, let's move on to the point then. That was, believe it or not, foundation for Pliny. And so Pliny the Younger, Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, he is actually not the big man in this family. The big man in the family is Gaius Plinius Secundus, his uncle. Maybe some of you have heard of Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Elder was a man of many parts, much ability. He was a Roman politician and statesman. He was an admiral of the Roman Navy. Actually in charge of the Roman fleet at Naples. And he was also an avid natural historian. This was his real passion. He was fascinated with natural history, the study of what we would call the science of living things and the movements of the earth and so forth. And he authored a great book that has only come down to us in fragments, The Natural History, Pliny's Natural History. He is, without any question, the leading natural historian of the ancient Roman world. He was not a scientist as we would think of it today, but he came close because he really valued personal observation and careful record keeping. And so in that position at Naples, this was AD 79. This is another little detour, but I hope that you'll find it interesting. AD 79, Naples, not too far away from Pompeii, was lit up by the eruption of the volcano Vesuvius on August the 25th. What a great opportunity for a natural historian, an actual eruption taking place. And Pliny the Younger was there with his mother. They were in residence with the admiral, and they marveled at this terrific explosion from the mountain off in the distance, which eventually clouded over the entire area. The wind that day was going off to the east, and they are a little bit west and north of Pompeii and Vesuvius, and so their view was probably pretty clear. Here's an effort to recreate that through the painting of Joseph Mallord William Turner, great romantic painter, The Eruption of Vesuvius, August the 25th, AD 79. So this was just too good to be true. A natural historian had to see what was going on. But at the same time, there were cries for help all over the region because there were small communities, not only Pompeii and Herculaneum, her sister city, but Stabiae, Oplantus, and other smaller places, including the residences, the villas of private wealthy Romans, all over this area. And so the historian, the natural historian, had to step aside for a bit and let the admiral come in. Pliny had to become a rescuer and not just an observer of this eruption. So while others were fleeing from this, he sailed into the teeth of it with a small fleet of people. Their goal was to try to help and to rescue as many people as they could. And it all failed terribly. The winds were contrary. He got in a situation where he had to go off further down to the south than he intended to, and take refuge in the home of a friend, Pomponianus, who was living there. He spent the night there in terror because of the eruption going on. It went on for about 48 hours. And then the next day, with the eruption still going on, he and Pomponianus, with a group of people, made their way close in to see what they could see. Pliny the Younger, the nephew, who did not go on this trip, had he done so, probably his later career would have been cut short. He records about all of this and about his uncle's demise because the man died. He went down to the beach to watch this, and then he just collapsed. And his companions, including his friend Pomponianus, fled the site. Apparently, he either asphyxiated from the poisonous fumes or had a heart attack, but he died there in the sands. Well, in 1917, a skull was found at Stabiae, along with the bodies of about 70 other people. And this individual was richly dressed, richly accoutred, a beautiful, short, heavily ornamented sword, a heavy gold chain, and some bracelets. The man who discovered it thought, this is the body of Pliny the Elder. And unfortunately, nobody else believed him. But with DNA testing, it's been determined that this was, in fact, an Italian of middle age, maybe about 55, 56. He could be Pliny, who knows? I think that's interesting. Archaeology, I think, is an amazing thing. Well, getting back to our real point, Pliny the Younger survives the ordeal. He's made fascinating records about his own observations about what went on, as well as the death of his uncle, that account being brought to him by those who survived in the face of Pliny the Elder dying. And he processes through the lower rungs of the sort of the ladder of preferment that will allow him to rise in his career until he becomes a governor, a consul. And he is stationed, and it's under the reign of the Emperor Trajan, the second of the so-called five good emperors. He's stationed at Bithynia, which is in northwest Turkey. That maroon sliver there shows you more or less the province over which Pliny the Younger was in charge. And so that's all been the fun part. Now we get serious. and there's a lot of reading. Pliny was famous for his letters. And in fact, he was a wide correspondent, and his letters have been preserved, including the ones where he's describing the eruption of Vesuvius, which is really interesting for volcanologists as well as historians in general. But this one has to do with business. He's writing to the emperor, Trajan, and as the governor of Rome in Bithynia and Pontus, he's asking, I got these people, what do I do with them? How do I treat them fairly? And there's a lot of bias here, as you will see. So he says in this letter, which for the sake of formality is letter number 10 it's letter number 96 in the Epistulae 10. So he says, "It is my practice, my Lord, to refer to you all matters concerning which I am in doubt. For who can better give guidance to my hesitation or inform my ignorance? I have never before participated in the trials of Christians, so I do not know what offenses are to be punished or investigated or to what extent. And I have not been a little hesitant as to whether there should be any distinction on account of age or no difference recognized between the very young and the very mature. Is pardon to be granted for repentance? Or if a man has once been a Christian, is it irrelevant whether he has ceased to be one? Is the name itself to be punished, even without offenses, or only the offenses perpetrated in connection with the name? Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have followed the following procedure. I interrogated them as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. Period. For I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished." He's trying to be fair. But wow, when you read that for the first time, that just slaps you in the face. You're stubborn? You're resistant? Therefore, execute them. Boy. Oh, oops. Thank you. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. So a Roman citizen, of course, can go to the emperor himself. Soon accusations spread because of these proceedings, as usually happens, and several incidents occurred. An anonymous document was published containing the names of many persons. Human nature can be despicable, can it? So some people are paying the ultimate price for their faith, and so others are like, maybe I can get rid of some of my enemies this way. And so anonymous denunciations are following. Those who denied that they were or had been Christians, when they invoked the gods in words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with statues of the gods, and also cursed Christ, none of which those who are really Christians can, it is said, be forced to do. These I thought should be discharged. So if you offer incense to the gods, you pour out some wine, you do that before the image of Trajan, you curse the name of Christ, then you're okay, you're good to go. Others, named by the informer, declared that they were Christians, but then denied it, asserting that they had been, but had ceased to be some 3 years before. Others, many years, some as much as 25 years, they all worshiped your image and the statues of the gods and cursed Christ. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed, now here it is, this is a hostile witness, and as Jay has pointed out, hostile witnesses can be very helpful because they've got no reason to lie. They're against the cause in the first place, and so their word can be taken as, I think, quite truthful. And Pliny in this case is certainly a hostile witness. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath not to do some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. Even this, they affirmed, they had ceased to do after my edict, by which, in accordance with your instructions, I had forbidden political associations. So that's really interesting. That's basically what we do. We don't meet at dawn, and I'm thankful for that. But aside from that, I can relate to this. This is the practice of a Christian. They're not binding themselves in an oath to do bad things. They're binding themselves to do good things, to only do good to others. Accordingly, Pliny says, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. And this is another lamentable thing about the ancient world. It was believed that in order to ensure fidelity, truthfulness, pain had to be inflicted. And so torture just went with interrogation, just like asking a question. Horrible. Let's thank God we don't live in this time. But, he says, I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition. So these women under torture, God bless them, basically were probably crying out to Christ and pleading to be let go and invoking God's name. And surely that's what he means by excessive superstition. And who wouldn't do that in extremity? I would certainly be praying if I were being tortured. So he goes on to say he postponed the investigation and hastened to consult you. Am I behind myself? I am. For the matter seemed to me to warrant consulting you, especially because of the number involved. For many persons of every age, every rank, and also both sexes are and will be endangered. For the contagion of this superstition has spread not only to the cities, but also to the villages and farms. But it seems possible to check and cure it. It is certainly quite clear that the temples, which had been almost deserted, have begun to be frequented, that the established religious rites, of course he's talking about pagan observances and worship, long neglected are being resumed, and that from everywhere sacrificial animals are coming, for which until now very few purchasers could be found. So when I read that, what that tells me is that the Christians in Bithynia and Pontus were doing their job. They were converting other pagans to the faith. And the temples were being emptied, and the sacrifices were not being needed. And he's trying to turn this tide back, and he claims that it's becoming effective. So, where was I? Hence, it is easy to imagine what a multitude of people can be reformed if an opportunity for repentance is afforded. So, as I've said, that is Epistulae 1096. The very next one in the collection is number 97, and that is Trajan's response to Pliny, which apparently Pliny carefully preserved and thus was found in his papers and included in the letters. So here's Pliny's response. He says, you observed proper procedure, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those who had been denounced to you as Christians. For it is not possible to lay down any general rule to serve as a kind of fixed standard. They are not to be sought out. We don't use the phrase much anymore. I guess it lived and died during the time of Bill Clinton's presidency, when homosexuals were becoming increasingly vocal in the armed forces. But at that time, the policy was, don't ask, don't tell. And that's exactly what he's talking about. Don't look for them. Don't go out there hunting them. Just let them alone. Don't seek them out. If they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished with this reservation. Oh, goodness. That whoever denies that he is a Christian and really proves it that is, by worshiping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall obtain pardon through repentance. But anonymously posted accusations ought to have no place in any prosecution, for that is both a dangerous kind of precedent and out of keeping with the spirit of our age. Thus Trajan. So you can see that by the standards of his time and by his culture and faith as a pagan, he's trying to do the right thing. I think you would agree. He doesn't know any more about Christianity, very likely, than Pliny himself. He just knows that they are of the other, and he just doesn't want to be bothered with them. And that was basically the attitude of all of the so-called 5 good emperors. They didn't really look for Christians, but if they came under their hand, then they would be persecuted. Well, that is pretty much what I had prepared to share with you about Pliny. I think it offers a lot of interesting insights. Mara ben Serapion and Lucian of Samosata, these are even briefer. So I don't know if we'll get to Eusebius tonight, but we'll see. We've only got 6 minutes. I doubt it. Okay, so Mara ben Bar Serapion, that basically means Mara, the son of Serapion. He is a Syrian who is a Stoic, not a Christian. Stoic philosophers, one of the so-called 5 good emperors was a Stoic philosopher, Marcus Aurelius, left a very fine book, which I think is really interesting reading today, called the Meditations. In Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, in his own words, he says more than once, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." There's a lot of really good, grounded common sense teaching and thought in the Stoic philosophy, even though it's not Christian. And Mara bar Serapion was one such individual. So around 73 BC, forget that, AD 73, around that time, this man is writing to his son. He's apparently of the wealthy class because his son is under the authority of a tutor. He keeps referring in this letter to his son being a little boy, which may or may not be the case. Fathers had authority over their even adult sons until they were, I think, about 35 as a rule. But surely his son is not that old because, again, he refers to him frequently as a young person, a little boy. But anyway, he hears from the tutor that his son is doing well in his studies, and he wants to encourage him and offer up examples. And so in this letter, which is about 3 pages or so long, here's what he says. He gives him some examples. He says, "What else can we say when the wise are forcibly dragged off by tyrants? Their wisdom is captured by insults, their minds are oppressed and without defense. What advantage did the Athenians gain from murdering Socrates? Famine and plague came upon them as a punishment for their crime. Or the people of Samos by the burning of Thygoras, seeing that in 1 hour the whole of their country was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates is not dead because of Plato, neither is Thygoras because of the statue of Juno, nor is the wise king because of the new law he laid down." So the general thinking is that the wise king to whom he's referring is Christ. And I don't myself question that. I don't know of anyone who really does because of the context in which he's laying this out. 3 great wise men who are persecuted by their own. And the point is that no good will ever come of that. So be wise, live a good life, and honor those who strive to do the same and strive to share goodness with you. So there's another source that, not Christian, that affirms Christ as a quote-unquote wise king, a good man, and how his new laws live on after him. Well, Lucian of Samosata is the next individual that I wanted to touch on, and this is a 19th century drawing. No effort whatsoever. No one knows what Lucian looked like. He is, according to what I've read, considered to be an early pioneer of fantasy and science fiction, which I think is really fascinating. I've always loved those genres in fiction because he comes up with some amazing, fantastic, ridiculous stories that are so wild that one wonders, what on earth? Well, he was a satirist as well. And so he is making fun of Christians. So Brother Jay, again, this is a hostile witness. And he has no reason to gratify anyone of the Christian belief or point of view because he's quite frankly making fun of them. And in modern collection, Samosata is there. So it's in what today is, I believe, the lower fringes of Turkey. And he lived around 120 to 200. So the interesting element that I want to touch on comes from one of his writings that is in the Classical Loeb Library. This is a publication. The Loeb Library publishes the ancient authors and then the relevant original language, Greek, Latin, what have you, and then the translation on the other side. So in volume 5 of the collected works of Lucian, we have the death of Peregrine. Peregrine is basically a con artist, and he's taking advantage of the gullibility of Christians in order to manipulate them and profit from them. And so Lucian is making fun of this individual and of the people whom he's conning, basically. When he says, the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted, and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. He meant it to be funny, and he meant it to be cruel, but I think that sounds pretty good. It sounds like the way a Christian should live. And again, he had no reason for dressing them up or making them sound better or giving them virtues that they did not possess, because he's frankly ridiculing these beliefs. All brothers? The ancient world didn't think that way. Christ truly introduced a revolution into human thought. Serving one another? Goods in common? Absurd. Immortal? What a joke. That's the way he looked at all of this. But these are tenets central to our faith and hopefully our practice. Well, I was behind. We got that close. Well, maybe this is just as well, because Eusebius, as I've already told you, is not only an historian, but he's also considered to be one of the early church fathers. So hopefully you found this interesting. I find it fascinating myself. And hopefully you'll join us next Wednesday, because then we're going to launch into the early church fathers, ante-Nicene or pre-Nicene Council, beginning with Eusebius of Caesarea. Oh, I'm going to miss it. I'm actually on that committee. Yeah, go ahead. That's the way I live. And I really didn't realize that it was going to be on a Wednesday. Wow. Well, shoot. Let's go ahead and do UCB. No, I'm kidding. I don't want a mass exodus. Let's have a word of prayer, please. Thank you, Father, for the day that you blessed us with and the good things that have been part of it. Thank you for life and the opportunities that you give us in this life to look around ourselves and to strive to do good and to be good and to serve others around us. Forgive us, Lord, when we fail to do that. We are guilty of many sins of omission and commission, and I pray that you would forgive us of both. I do pray that you would bless Brother Fred and the passing of Sister Sybil. I pray that you would watch over Carol and Diane as they're traveling back. She's suffered so much. I pray that you would bless all of those who are in need of comfort, Brother Duncan's family and others who are needing encouragement. Thank you for the good things that we've heard tonight about Sister Tammy. I pray that you would help us to be the light and the salt, the leaven that you've called us to be, in encouraging those around us and helping to bear the image of Christ in our lives. Thank you for these good people who have been in attendance tonight and who have been patient with me. I pray that you would help me as I continue on in this series of studies, that it will be interesting and encouraging and fruitful as we have extra biblical sources that strengthen our faith and that help us to better understand the things that we already so devoutly believe in. I pray all of this in Christ's name. Amen.